Zuby, welcome to the show, man.
Thanks for inviting me, man. Happy to be here.
Hey, really appreciate you coming out here. This is kind of full circle for me. I think we have a mutual friend, Tyler Tote, in common. He was the first person I reached out to be a guest on the podcast. And I was going to do it in Vegas. It didn't work out, had a scheduling conflict. And through him, I sort of got connected to some of your content and been sort of watching you too. And I love the fact that you two are so positive on the internet. Oh, seriously, because that's how I got connected to him. Is we were on some thread and somebody was talking a bunch of junk, and we both had the same response, which was just not respond in kind, try to be positive and uplifting to people. And I think that's really missing in a lot of social media right now. And so I just kudos for that, man.
No, well, thank you, man. I hear it from a lot of people now. And I've heard it a lot over the years in many different places. And so I'm glad the positivity is resonating with people.
It definitely is. And I think that people who make an intentional effort to do that and get past the friction, because there's always friction,
of course,
right? I think they really do the world a service. And so maybe you could talk me through like your philosophy around being positive. Like why are you intentionally positive? What are you trying to gain from it? Maybe some challenges that are associated with it.
Yeah, sure thing. It's a great question. I think I don't like answering questions with questions, but what's the alternative? Being negative, right? Being negative, being pessimistic, being angry, spreading fear, bringing people down, all of that. Do we not have enough of that in the world? And haven't we always? I mean, it depends on what level you want me to answer this. I mean, you could go deep and religious and spiritual, and I could say that as a believer in Christ, as a Christian, we are called to be a light in a dark world. The world has always had positivity and negativity in it. Anyone who's taken even just a cursory glance around the globe or a cursory glance at history, I think it's just obvious. It's self-evident that that is the truth. I often say that human beings are both the best and worst things on the planet. There's so much good, there's so much bad, and we have the option. We have choices that we make hundreds, thousands of times a day, these little micro choices, and some of them are macro choices. And I just do my best to try to make good ones and to try to use my voice and my power and my platform and my influence and my talents to tilt the world in a direction towards hope, positivity, and truth, ultimately. That's been my mission for a very long time. It's actually why I became a musician to begin with, beyond just enjoying creating and enjoying making music. I always wanted to use my voice for good, and particularly in the genre of music that I make, hip hop and rap. We know, I mean, it has I would say, fairly deserved reputation for being negative, for violence, for promoting and glorifying things that are not pro-social and are not generally good for people. And, the world's not all positive. So of course there's going to be some of that negativity, but there's some sort of line between talking about things that are negative and addressing things that are negative. And anyone who follows me knows that I have no problem doing that. But that doesn't mean that you champion it or you promote it or you glorify it, right? It's one thing to call out something and say, hey, that's not good, or just to talk about it just from a sense of reality. Hey, people need to be aware of this thing. But you don't want to get locked into the abyss. You don't want to just get locked into all the negativity, because you can do that forever. You really can. There's no shortage of evil in the world. There's no shortage of things to complain about. There's no shortage of things to be angry about domestically or internationally. You can do that forever. So I see a lot of people doing that. I've seen a lot of that my entire life, and it's been going on since before I was born. So if I'm going to have a platform, and thank God over the years I've achieved a platform that literally reaches millions of people every single week. And so I just do my best to try to help people in some way, shape, or form on a daily basis. And it's really like my calling and my mission in life.
Awesome. That's great to hear. I think a lot of people, especially ones with large followings, don't understand or conceptualize the amount of impact that they can have. I heard Jordan Peterson talk about this once, about the network node concept of how many people you're connected with now versus how many you could have been connected with historically as a human being. And it's just exponential now. It's like you can influence just tens of millions of people for the positive or negative. And every little thing you do is a micro, either you're aiming a little bit towards hell or a little bit towards heaven, right? Yeah. With every little thing you do. And so everything, it's meaningful. And I think people lose sight of that sometimes, that their actions, they think, oh, it's just this thing. It doesn't matter. It's this one tweet. It's this one snarky comment. I'm just going to tear this person down for a second. And I don't think people appreciate the gravity that their words hold.
Well, it's difficult because it's new and we're not designed for it. The fact that I have a couple million followers online, that there's millions of people around the world who have voluntarily clicked a button which says, hey, I want to see more of this guy. I want to see more of his posts. I want to see more of his videos. I want to see more of his photos, whatever it is. I want to hear more of his thoughts. It's humbling, but it's also somewhat scary, and it's totally unnatural. I mean, if you think over the course of human history, who had real-time access to millions of people around the globe? Like nobody. At best, I mean, if you're like a president or a king or a prime minister or maybe some top-level celebrity, you have some ability to address millions of people. Even then, it wasn't in real time. You could put out a statement and publish something, and then it comes out and people read it. And it was also one way. You could broadcast something, but they couldn't come back to you and respond and share their feedback, positive or negative, and message you and talk to you. So in our hands or in our pockets now, even someone who just has a few hundred or a few thousand followers, which they might not think is that much. I mean, say, for example, if you put out a video or you put out a post or something and say 10,000 people see it. In internet terms, 10,000, a lot of people think sounds like a relatively small number. But if you've ever seen 10,000 people, if you've been to a music venue or some event that has 10,000 people and you actually see how many people that is, let alone 50,000, 100,000, a million, 10 million, we're talking about enormous numbers of people. And the technology has changed and updated, but we're still the same fundamentally as human beings. So 20 years ago, we didn't have this tech. Just 20 years ago, the smartphones didn't even exist. We didn't have this tech. We had nascent social media, but it wasn't anything close to what it is now. And now all day, every day, we're walking around with supercomputers in our pockets. We have the ability to just communicate with all people all over the world at all different levels, from just your everyday person on the streets to hugely influential figures, be they politicians or celebrities or athletes or business tycoons, whatever it is. And everyone's on the same platforms. And so it's just a tool. And with a tool, as you know, you can use it for good or bad. If someone gives you a knife, you can use it to prepare food. You can use it to cut yourself. You can use it to cut somebody else. You can use it to, craft some type of sculpture or make some piece of art. A knife is not inherently good or bad. It's just like, okay, what do you choose to do with it? Smartphones, social media. Some people are like, oh, social media is the worst thing to ever happen, or smartphones are terrible and everyone's getting addicted and it's terrible for children. I understand where all those arguments come from, and there's an element of truth to them. But I think that people blame the tools too much. People get stuck on blaming the tool and blaming the device instead of thinking, okay, this is a powerful tool. What is my responsibility when it comes to how I use this and how I interact with other human beings? And that's the part people often forget, because when you're on your phone, when you're on these platforms, it's very easy to at least temporarily forget that you're talking to other human beings, because it doesn't seem like you are, because you can't see them. They're not there with you. Every time I post something, say on X, I've got about 1.25 million followers on there now, which I think would make it about the 150th biggest country by population if it were a nation. And when I'm posting, I'm typically by myself. So as I'm posting, like I'm not imagining a crowd of 1 million people in front of me. well, maybe I am because I think about these weird things, but it's easy to forget it. It's easy. You just put something out there and you're not thinking, oh my gosh, it's going to reach that many people. And most people just aren't that cognizant of it. And then due to sharing features, due to reposts and things like that, even someone who doesn't have a big following, they could still end up reaching millions of people. Maybe they thought, hey, this is going to just stay within my small circle, right? And then it just takes one person with a sizable following and boom, next thing you know, this thing is going viral and everyone, you've seen it, right? You've seen it. Just someone posts something fairly innocuous and it ends up being seen by 50 million, 100 million people end up seeing this picture or video or a few lines of text. And gosh, yeah, we should be cognizant and careful of how we use that.
Yeah, I think far too few people consider their responsibility with respect to social media, because it's almost like I see the arguments against like all my problems are the government's fault. Oh, the social media is ruining everything. What I've found though is social media tends to reflect, it's like a mirror, right? It's like however you are online, social media, the companies, they just want engagement. They want your eyeballs. They want you to continue to engage with the product. And so if they find out that fighting with people and, being negative, they're going to just feed more of that to you, and you're going to get spiraled in that loop. And
yeah, what you say there is so interesting. And I think it's important for people to understand that all it does is it preys on and amplifies human biology. So just as the way the human brain is wired, we are more sensitive towards negative emotions than we are toward positive ones. Anyone who's ever studied advertising or marketing knows this. Anyone who's worked in media knows this. Anyone who just is on social media and pays attention knows this. There's a reason why virtually all news media focuses more on negative stories than positive, whether it's a TV station, it's a newspaper, and so on. It doesn't matter. It's simply incentives. So when people are getting mad at what the so-called algorithm is showing them, or they're getting mad at what's on the news media, or they're getting mad at what's trending on social media, people have to just remember that this is just an amplification of their own psychology. It's not that could you code an evil algorithm? Yes, you could. But typically that's not what happens. It just becomes this sort of self-reinforcing spiral. So once you're aware of it and you recognize these incentives and you recognize, I guess, what we could call like sort of limbic hijacking, then you can at least guard against it a little, because we all have this within us. It's the reason why if you posted something online, or even if you were just in the real world and you got 100 positive comments or 100 pieces positive reviews or 100 people said something nice, and then one person leaves a mean comment, one person leaves that 1-star review, one person says something nasty about how you're dressed or whatever it is, which one sticks in your brain? Which one do you end up dwelling on and pondering for the next few hours, sometimes the next few days, for some people the rest of their lifetime? It's the negative, because we're like threat detectors. So I guess historically it would have made sense, and it still does if you're actually in a dangerous situation, to be very sensitive to any type of perceived threats. But it's almost like our biology doesn't recognize if it's just a mean comment online from an anonymous person or if it's like some actual threat to us. So it registers like a threat. And I don't know if there's a way to totally override that, because it's just part of our biology. But I just think that if we can raise awareness of it and just make people more conscious of that fact, whether they're on the creation side or they're on the consumption side, then over time, maybe, hopefully we can sort of change the environment around this a little bit. But at least there's people making an effort to do that. So it's a start.
Yeah, I'm definitely seeing that. How do you deal with those people, right? 'Cause I think there's the people that fall into that sort of limbic hijacking, like you talked about. I think there's also people that just want attention. And so when you have a big account like this, you've got to have people just saying horribly mean stuff. I was watching Tyler last week about his adopted kids. There's racist comments that I'm just shocked at the level of like hatred that is spewed towards some of these larger accounts. I think it really is it's just trolling for attention. How do you deal with that?
Yeah. So for the most part, I ignore it. For the most part, I ignore it, and I tend to find the humor in it. I will say, and I don't mean this in any sort of a haughty way at all, but most people have absolutely no idea what it's like to have a big following on social media, because 99.99% of people never have and never will. People just don't recognize it because it's also not a linear thing, right? So it's not like at 10,000 followers you get 10 times as much weird stuff as you do at 1,000. It's like you might be, 30 times more weird stuff. And then between 10,000 and 100,000 is not a 10x, it's like a 300x. And then at like a million plus, I don't even know people who have like 10 million, 100 million followers or whatever. I don't even know or really want to know the kinds of nonsense that they deal with, because it becomes weird. Also because there comes a level where you kind of get seen as a target. So because your account is large, you have people who are like, oh, okay, I know what strategy I can use. Let me go and target someone who's got a big following and has already got attention and so on, and I can siphon some of that off. And also, if you crave attention, why would you try to get attention off a small account? It's like, no, go for the biggest target that's out there, and if you crave attention, you'll get more attention. And so it's strange. You learn a lot about human psychology. I do think it's important for me to say that in my case, I mean, the love versus hate is 100 to 1, and the hate is purely online. And it's not, at this point, I've been online. I've been putting myself out there for over 20 years. I started out just as a musician. And when you're an artist, you get used to public feedback, whether it's love and praise, or it's, just criticism, or it's actual hate. I remember being 19 years old, and when I was putting out some of my initial music, that was the first time I sort of came across actual hating. I remember when I was like a kid, when I was like in my teens, and I used to hear rappers talking about having haters or whatever, and I was like, are they just like making that up? Like, why would someone just hate you because you're successful or popular or whatever? Like, it didn't really make sense to me. And then I remember coming to a point where I was like, oh, like that is real. There is a subsection of population who will hate you, not because you've hurt them or you've done something to them or you've done something nasty, but just because they don't like the fact that other people like you. They feel some sort of jealousy or envy or resentment because you're in a position that, I don't know, maybe they want to be in, or they don't understand, or whatever the case may be. And I remember first coming across that, in my late teens. But I guess at this point I've had a lot of experience just in terms of dealing with the positive and the negative. And over the course of hundreds of thousands of real world interactions and millions of online interactions, you get to a point where you've kind of seen it all. So as horrible as certain things can be, and when you're seeing it coming at other people, I mean, like you said, with our friend Tyler, he's one of the nicest guys in the world, online and offline. I can absolutely vouch for him. And he's the kind of person who in a sane world, like, how on earth would this person have haters? Like, how would this person be a target for any type of negativity? Like, we've got some real scumbags in this world. And if your target is Tyler, I'd say if your target is me, like, you're kind of barking up the wrong tree. Like, if you're going to go at someone, why don't you go at someone who's actually, like, you know what I mean, doing some real bad stuff to humanity? But I guess the people who are doing this don't operate on logic. So,
well, maybe it is logical though. Like when you think about, and I've seen this where people who are genuinely nice people that are, being a positive influence, that are successful, they sort of shine a light on other people that aren't living up to their potential, I think. And I think it's a lot easier sometimes for people to throw some hate at you as opposed to look in the mirror and be like, ooh, I really need to get my stuff together. That's a lot easier of a thing to do. So I don't know if it's necessarily irrational. Yeah. It's just kind of a jerk move.
Yeah, I get that. And another thing that happens with it is, I was talking about the sort of exponential growth as, say, a social media account grows or someone's popularity grows. Another thing that happens is the more famous or popular somebody becomes, and I don't consider myself famous. There's people a million times more famous than me. people, I've seen this because I do know quite a lot of famous people now, and this strange thing happens where, as I said before, people increasingly forget that they're human beings, both on the positive and negative. Like when you get the extremes of celebrity worship, right? And we've seen this for decades. I don't know if you've ever seen that footage of like when Michael Jackson used to perform and people are literally fainting and crying, and like he just walks past them and they faint. Like, what? Right? Like you're just rendered unconscious because a famous person whose music you like walks past you. Like, that is bizarre. Yeah, but that used to happen. Look at all the, the Swifties, or when the Justin Bieber hype, or like Beyonce, like whatever it is, people treat them like they are deities, like they're gods. They forget that these are human beings. And the same on the negative side, where they think that, oh, because this person, especially if someone is rich and successful, they forget that they still have feelings and that they're still human. People have this idea, oh, like it's okay to just completely attack and hate on like a celebrity or whatever. Oh, well, they're rich and they're famous, so I can just use them as a punching bag completely. And people kind of forget, oh, hey, that is a human being. Maybe they do have money. Maybe they do. Maybe a lot of people know who they are, but they still functionally are the same as everybody else, right? So when people are there, like threatening them or having, you're threatening someone because you don't like the song they made, like that's, I mean, it's a little extreme there, right? Like, what have they done to you? And it's why even myself, I've always been really careful with how I phrase things and word things. And sometimes I check people on this, right? So I'll sometimes overhear someone saying like, I hate insert so-and-so. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, oh, when did you meet them? They're like, what do you mean? I'm like, you just said you hate them. Like, what did they do to you? They're like, no, they haven't done anything to me. Like, I just, I don't like the way he came across in that interview. I'm like, okay, that's a different statement. Like, just right. Say you hate somebody, right? I hate Justin Bieber. Like, what? Like, what's he done to you? Right? I mean, you could be like, I'm not a fan of his music, or he comes across this way to me. But to say you hate the individual, I think that's again, I don't think people think about what they're saying sometimes. Like, that's actually a very severe statement. That's the kind of thing that should be reserved for someone who has like personally done something like particularly horrible to the world or to you. But people kind of throw these terms around a lot. Yeah, maybe same with love as well, right? I love that person. I'm in love with that person. It's like,
yeah, you don't know that person.
You don't know them. So I get it in a sense, and I know that people, of course, use hyperbole, but sometimes it's greater than that, and it can devolve into either infatuation on the sort of positive side and idolatry even, or on the negative side. It can devolve into much scarier things.
Really want to ask you this. How do you balance being positive on social media with your sort of, adherence to the truth and being a truth-seeking individual and getting into discussions with people where you might have a disagreement? It seems like it's a difficult needle to thread, right? Or it's been difficult for me anyway, because I want to be very respectful to people, and I feel like I'm almost biasing too much on the side of not wanting to be too confrontational while interrogating what's actually true in the world, right? So how do you view that? Because it feels like to explore anything meaningful, try to find the truth of any sort of important topic, it's going to require some conflict with people. And so how do you manage that whole endeavor?
I think the first part is, if you believe that truth is a moral good, if you believe that the truth inherently has a value and is inherently good, then you move away from the sort of fake, nice, quote unquote, politically correct obsession of, oh no, we can't say true things because someone somewhere out there could be offended. People will be offended by the truth, and they always have been. At the same time, there is a way to state something that is true, or to ask a question, or to engage with someone that is not nasty or abrasive, right? There are people who are like, oh, I'm just all about the truth, but they have zero tact. right? And so they're just like these flamethrowers who are just like, I'm just going to spit out uncomfortable truths all day long, and I'm going to phrase it in the most aggressive, potentially offensive way. Again, you know, I can walk and chew gum at the same time. So I'm not a fan of the fake be nice, meaning lie all the time, right? A lot of times what people call being nice is kind of like lying or skirting around the truth. There's particular issues where you really, really see this. But I think that the truth is inherently a moral good, and then you operate with tact. I think another part of it as well is, in my own case, I don't have any agenda beyond seeking the truth and seeking to, as I said at the beginning, uplift humanity and influence people in some type of positive way. If I have any sort of agenda, it's those. A lot of people do have an agenda. If someone is a left-wing social commentator or politician or whatever, they have an agenda. Their agenda is to pursue their ideology and to use language in a way and events that happen around the world. Everything filters through their agenda, right? So I'll tell you when this is. There's times where this is extremely obvious, right? A shooting incident occurs in the USA. There are people who, while the bodies are still warm, they're ramming down their political agenda. Yep. Whether it's gun control or they're pro Second Amendment, and they're immediate, like there's not even a moment of grieving. It's just, hey, cool, this incident happened. This is something that is useful and expedient for my political agenda. And they'll do that with every single issue. They just run it through their filter because they have a strong agenda. That happens. Political is a very obvious example of how that happens, whether it's coming from the left side or it's coming from the right side. Any major incident or talking point, hey, how can I use this to push my agenda further? In my personal case, I don't have an agenda. And it's also why I don't worry about, I spend, there must be thousands of hours of me talking on the internet at this point. And I don't know, 200,000 plus social media posts. And I don't worry about, I don't have hate in my heart. I genuinely don't have any, I don't have any hatred for any individual, and I don't have any hatred for any group. A lot of people do. There are people who genuinely do harbor negative feelings and sentiments towards an entire group, towards black people as a whole, white people as a whole, Jews as a whole, Muslims as a whole, men as a whole, women as a whole, right? There are many, many people in this world who do harbor these grievances and very discriminatory viewpoints. And so people like that, they tend to always have to be like either they're just out there with it, or they have to be like very careful, kind of like not to let it slip. And I don't have that. So I'm not worried about it coming out because it's not there to begin with. Does that kind of make sense? So I can just speak and answer things honestly without thinking like, ooh, I should phrase it this way or that way or whatever. And if I say something which someone takes the wrong way, or which someone finds some offense in, or which maybe I just didn't word as well as I could, I'm happy to address it. But if someone is just like upset by the fact I said something that was true, then okay, like that's on you as an adult. I get, there's things that offend me every single day. Whether I tend to be far more offended by things that are not true than things that are true. But there are truths in this world that we wish were not right. There's certain statistics I look at and I'm like, man, like that's a bad statistic. Like I wish that wasn't, I wish that statistic wasn't what it is, but it is. So it's like, okay, well, that's the truth. So if we are going to try to make the world a better place on any level, we have to start by acknowledging reality. And then we can discuss potential solutions, and then we can find them. If it's like, hey, we're not even allowed to discuss, we can't even talk about this because it's so uncomfortable or whatever, then it's like, well, we're never going to get to any type of solution because all we're doing is sort of covering our eyes and sticking our hands over our ears and pretending that this thing doesn't exist. And therefore it just persists and might even get worse.
Yeah, there's a famous Ayn Rand quote. It says, you can ignore reality, but you can't ignore the consequences of ignoring reality.
Very true.
That's something that's really stuck with me over the years. And I think a lot of people nowadays are trying to ignore reality. So quick question. How big do you think Elon's purchase of X has been for this whole endeavor of truth seeking?
Incredibly important. Incredibly important. The Overton window has shifted. The Overton window is very real, and it's shifted. And what I call the censorship industrial complex, particularly coming from big tech, but also being pushed by many, many governments around the world, and this weird conglomeration that came together and really peaked, I'd say around 2021 is when it really peaked during the era I politely refer to as the scamdemic. It got bad. It got really bad. I mean, and I see this as someone who's been on social media a long time and who's been producing and putting stuff out for a long time. The walls started closing in around 2015. So I've been on social media over 20 years. I've been on X, formerly Twitter, for over 15 years. So I've seen how the platform has progressed from 2009 to about 2015. It kind of felt like it does now. Mm-hmm. It was pretty free. Like, unless you were violently threatening someone or, planning some terrorist activity or trying to post like illegal material or something, it was pretty hard to get banned. It was kind of like, it was very pro free speech. And then the wall started closing in mid 2010s, and it got a little bit more aggressive to the point where just your kind of everyday conservative or Trump supporter or, libertarian, whatever, was at risk of either being shadow banned, getting suspended. I've been temporarily suspended before, or outright banned from the platform. You have to remember, again, people have short-term memories. People forget that they banned a sitting U.S. president. They banned Donald Trump from, I don't care whether someone loves him, hates him, dislikes him, whatever. The concept that these big tech companies collude to ban the president of the United States of America from social media is insane. So if they could do that, it was like, oh my gosh, like what chance does your everyday person have? Like, anyone can be taken out for any reason, and they don't even need to give an explanation. They just say, content violation or hate speech or whatever. Like, they don't even need to explain it. And that's kind of a scary position to be in. And I think some people don't understand the sort of scale and ramifications of it, right? Because you'll have the people say, oh, who cares? It's just a Twitter account. It's just a Facebook account. It's just a YouTube channel, whatever. There's over 4 billion people in the world on social media. The majority of adults in the entire world use social media. So if you kick somebody out of it and say, hey, you're not even allowed to join in this conversation, you can't watch, you can't listen, you certainly can't engage, then that has real ramifications, because that's where the conversations are happening. You hear the quote a lot, social media isn't real life. And there's an element of truth to that. But there's an element of the truth to the fact that, well, it sort of is, because most of the people on social media are real people, like all of them except the bots. I don't know how many bots there are, but excluding the bots, these are real human beings, and they are having real conversations. And there is a clear reflection between what happens on social media and what happens in the real world in both directions. And that is only increasing, right? The importance of these platforms is getting more and more important. So just like it would be pretty crazy to, no matter how much you dislike a person, it would be pretty crazy if, all the telephone networks decided that, we're deplatforming you from, you can't use the phone, or, the water companies cut you off, or the electrical companies cut you off or something. Someone can make an argument that, social media is not as important as, having a telephone, or, certainly having running water or electricity. But the precedent is very concerning, especially when it's so opaque. And so coming back to your original question, I think that by Elon buying X, it doesn't just have an impact on that particular platform. It's like a crack in the dam. So they've been building up this dam, this huge firewall, all the meta platforms, YouTube, Google, Twitter, like TikTok, like all of them, those walls are just coming up and coming up and coming up. And then the fact that there is one to begin with, where it's like, okay, there is now a mainstream platform with hundreds of millions of users, where again, within reason, you can kind of say whatever you want and hear whatever you want and just engage. And we're not going to censor you. We're not going to, drop fact checks on you every 3 seconds. There is the community notes, which is great because if someone's straight up lying, they, can be called out for it and corrected. But that causes all the other platforms to change. Mm-hmm. And they have. YouTube is not as censorious now as it was in 2020, 2021, 2022. YouTube has loosened its grip a bit. Facebook has loosened its grip a bit. Mark Zuckerberg is going through this entire freaking transformation
reinventing
right
himself.
now. Yeah, so it has an impact on everything, and it goes beyond social media. It shifts the Overton window where more and more people are like, oh, okay, we can now talk about this, right? Like take all the COVID stuff, everything from lockdowns to mask mandates to vax mandates to the vaccines themselves or whatever. Dude, if you said the wrong thing or you interviewed the wrong person or you didn't phrase something like, they were just, even if you were a doctor, they wouldn't hesitate to ban you. And now people just talk about all that stuff freely, right? Everyone now talks like I was talking back in, early mid 2020 when my account was massively at risk, right? But now, lots of people feel comfortable to speak on that. Gender issues, BLM. Mm-hmm. Everyone knows it's a scam now, right? No one is afraid to call it a scam at this point. 3 years ago, you'd better not say anything bad about BLM. You better post your black square. So it's like you can breathe. You can kind of breathe again. You don't have this sort of Damocles hanging over your head where you just don't know. You log in every day and you're like, hopefully my account is still there. Hopefully, right? Hopefully, I haven't, violated the wrong thing. So that's incredibly important. And then we were talking before just about the truth. Mm-hmm. If you are speaking the truth and seeking the truth, you have no desire to censor people. Censorship is a tool to protect lies and to protect things that cannot stand up to scrutiny. I have no problem with anyone voicing their viewpoints. If someone wants to go out there and, tell me that there's 18 genders and you can switch in between them and women can have penises and men can get pregnant and men should be in women's sports and, all white people are bad and all black people are oppressed, whatever narrative, as goofy as I think it may be, I have no interest in censoring those people. I'm like, all right, cool. I think my point is better than yours. And I think I have the evidence to back up, to refute those points. So let's have that conversation. Let's have that debate. You can only take those narratives mainstream if you censor the people who are like, oh, no. Like that's nonsense. So whenever someone is trying to censor other people, like this is something I found fascinating. I made a post on this when Elon first bought Twitter and it went viral. I said, a lot of people are upset today, not because they fear that they will be censored, but because they fear their ideological opponents won't be. Right. So this was the time when there were all these like big left wing accounts and journalists and whatever. I mean, now they're all saying, I'm leaving, like after they lost the election. Sky. Right. I'm leaving. I'm leaving. Right. But at that time, a couple of years ago, it was like, oh, Elon's going to turn this into this or this. And I was like, all that's happened is you've lost your stranglehold. You've lost your ability to censor everyone who you were censoring before. So you're not afraid that you're going to get banned. You just don't like the fact that the people you wanted banned or the people you got banned are going to be allowed to speak. And last point on this, the thing that people often forget, we talk a lot about freedom of speech, and I'm an advocate for freedom of speech. People also forget that there is something called freedom of association. So if there is something out there in the world, if there is a person, if there is a song, if there is a book, if there is a podcast, if there's something you don't like, you don't have to consume it. You don't need to be friends with everyone. You don't need to listen to every podcast. I'm not going to start going on Spotify and Apple Music and trying to get banned every song that I personally find distasteful or offensive. Like, that is crazy. You have choice. So if you don't like something, don't consume it. If there's someone out there who you think is immoral or they're nasty or you just disagree with them and they trigger you, whatever it is, you can mute them, you can block them, you can just ignore them. And people kind of like forget they have that power and they want to go to daddy government or they want to cry to whichever big tech giant and demand more censorship. And it's like, just grow up. There's a lot of things in this world that I do not like. A lot. Like a lot of things. But unless it's crossing certain lines, it can exist. It can exist.
Yeah, and I think that's a disingenuous argument most of the time, because they always seem to default to it's dangerous. Yes. Don't you know if you spread misinformation or disinformation or say something that's untrue or something that's harmful, someone's going to get harmed. But I don't think people realize the insane amount of danger that comes along with abrogation of free speech. Mm-hmm. Like that.
People aren't good at understanding trade-offs. Right? I know Thomas Sowell has that famous quote, there's no solutions, there's only trade-offs. And it's very true just in life in general. Pretty much every decision we make, from what we're going to eat for breakfast to what clothes we're going to wear to who we're going to date or marry to what job we're going to pursue to where we're going to live, it's trade-offs. Like by picking one thing, you're automatically not picking a whole bunch of other things. And everything has ups and downs, pros and cons, advantages and disadvantages. And I think more people need to just sort of make the point. For example, when it comes to freedom of speech is messy. Freedom of speech is messy. It's not, I understand the desire to censor. It's not something I struggle to understand. It is natural. We all have things we're sensitive about. We have our religious beliefs. We have our political beliefs. We have our cultural beliefs. We have just our personalities. We have our experiences, things that we've been through, things we've seen other people go through. Someone could, if you stand in front of an audience of 10,000 people, 1,000 people, 100 people, and I don't know, you make a joke or you say something that's a bit edgy or you just make a very strong statement on a polarizing topic, there will be some people who take offense or get triggered or it reminds them of something they don't like. Or right there will be people who do get offended. And there's something instinctual, again, coming back to that threat thing, we're threat detectors. Mm-hmm. I don't like that thing. I want it gone. I don't want to hear it. I want to get rid of it. So there's like a natural instinct to censor, and it's something that you kind of have to fight. So when it comes to freedom of speech, it's like, hey, this means we're going to see and hear some things that we don't like. There will be individuals, people, organizations. There will be, promoting ideas that I don't like or I think are immoral or I find repugnant and so on. But you know what? The trade-off is worth it. The trade-off is worth it. That's better than the alternative where we have some sort of arbiter who is deciding what is real information and what is misinformation and what is appropriate and what is not appropriate, what is safe and what is dangerous. And I'm like, look, I'd rather people have the ability to hash it out. We can have some super basic safeguards, right? Which are even in the US, which is the only country that has protected freedom of speech in the way that it does. There are still some legal safeguards, very simple ones where it's like, okay, there are defamation laws. There are false advertising laws. There are laws about, inciting, directly calling for violence or threatening somebody or threatening someone's family, right? It's like, okay, fair, right? Fair enough, right? Because these are things that can cause like actual physical danger, right? These are things that could cause people to actually physically be hurt. But outside of that, it's like, yeah, it's going to be messy, and that's a trade-off. I think it's a good trade-off. And I'll tell you what, I wish that the people who disagreed with that position would just be more honest with it. I know many people who don't support absolute freedom of speech. Many people. Particularly, we're in the Middle East right now, right? So they don't have the same concept here of like absolute freedom of speech, particularly when it comes to very sensitive issues like religion, right? And I get that. And, it's just like, okay, well, different societies decide where their line is. The UK has more, UK has hate speech. Every country in Europe has hate speech laws. From country to country, what they consider hate may change, but that exists in most of the world. So actually, most people in the world do not support sort of unrestricted freedom of speech. And I just wish people, what annoys me is when you have the people who are like, oh, I'm pro free speech, but all these people should be banned. I'm like, well, you're just say you don't support. Don't just say you don't support freedom of speech, right? Just like if you don't support the Second Amendment, just say you don't support the Second Amendment. Say, you know what? Like, I don't think it's right that private citizens should be able to like own all these firearms and stuff. Like, I think that the cons outweigh the pros. That would be at least be an honest argument. But if it's like, oh, well, I support the Second Amendment, but I don't just say you don't. If you don't support freedom of speech, then again, funnily enough, we can use our freedom of speech to have that conversation and debate. And it's one that is worth having, because I think the argument in favor of leaning more heavily towards freedom of speech is a more powerful argument than the opposite.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, because I think that people fail to appreciate that human beings are kind of like a decentralized computing machine. Is that we're all nodes and we all got a piece of the puzzle, and we all think we're right? We all think our ideas are right, and until we sort of engage with others and have them refined, and when we do it, and it's very complicated how human beings interact this way. And with social media, I think it's gotten exponentially more complicated, and we've got more people we can interact with and refine ideas, and like I said, communicate with people. They're very, very smart people that might have opposing ideas. You can watch them discuss it online, and we can all benefit from that, right? And I think a lot of people don't appreciate the value in that sort of distributed computational, bio machine that we have, plugged into the tech. It is super, super powerful. But to your point, I think oftentimes the reason people oppose it is because it's tribalism, essentially, that they're on an ideological tribe. And if somebody is saying something that's counter to that, it's sort of it's that threat detection thing. It's an evolutionary mechanism. Like, oh, they're the other. They're attacking my ideas. My ideas are part of my identity, my tribe's identity. Therefore, we've got to ban them. I think that's really all the thought that goes into it. That's a shame.
Yeah, most people don't think that much.
Fair.
That sounds very disparaging, but it's true. Most people are not particularly deep thinkers. But if something makes them feel a certain way, they know it makes them feel a certain way. But most won't kind of go through the steps of really drilling into that and thinking about, okay, well, let's look at it from this angle and second, third, fourth order consequences. You saw this a lot during the whole pandemic era, for example. Like, I remember having a conversation with a smart young woman. She actually had worked in the media before, but we were having a conversation. She was from California, kind of like a typical, 30-something-year-old California liberal woman, right? Nice, but I would disagree with her on many different issues. And we were having this was during the peak of the sort of peak of the mandates in 2021, and we were having a conversation about vax mandates, and she was, to her credit, she admitted that she is in favor of them. And I didn't jump on her attacker. I was like, okay. I was like, interesting. Okay. So you think the government should enforce that every person has to have a medical procedure, has to take a medicine which might help them, might harm them, right? There's always a risk, right? And she was like, yeah, I do. I was like, okay. Do you recognize that every law ultimately is backed up by the threat of violence? She was like, no, that's not true. I was like, well, no. I was like, no. I was like, it is. Think. I was like, think this through. Someone causes a crime. Like, what happens? And she's like, the police come. I'm like, okay. And if you don't comply, what happens? She was like, well, they shout at you. I'm like, okay. And then you continue, right? And so I got her to. She never thought in her entire life that laws are backed up by the threat of violence. So I got her to concede that point. And then I was like, okay, given that, would you feel comfortable? Oh yeah, I'm speaking her language, right? Feelings, right? Would you feel comfortable using the police to go to people's houses or workplaces who haven't taken a vaccine and potentially arresting them, putting them in prison, potentially, if they resist, beating them up, pinning them to the ground, right? Using whatever force is necessary.
Hold on. I mean, up to the point of murder.
Yes, exactly. And she was like, no, I'm not comfortable with that at all. And I'm like, okay, well, that's what that would mean. And she actually, she acquiesced. She was like, I didn't think about that. Like, I guess you're right. So she was like, yeah, I think people should take it, but yeah, you're right. They shouldn't be legally forced to. I was like, yeah, well, that's what happened. And I also gave some examples, because I was like, if someone stole from someone, or if someone sexually assaulted someone, or if someone, took someone's life, like, would you would you be okay with physical force being used against them? And she was like, yeah. I was like, yeah, I agree, right? Like there are things where actually, yeah, we'd collectively agree, okay, that is valid. That's a valid, reason to use force against someone. But something like that, it was like, well, no. And it was interesting because before she was actually telling me that she'd been to, I kind of got the extra one in there because she'd been telling me that she'd actually recently been to some of this 2021. So she'd actually been to some of the, or was it? Yeah, 2021. But she was telling me that she'd been to some of the BLM protests and stuff in the previous year. And that was actually something she felt quite like passionately about. I was like, do you know what's the most unvaccinated demographic? And right? I was like, yeah, it's Black Americans, right? So even more so.
Wow.
Again, right? Because I know how, I'm aware of how conservatives have a way of thinking, liberals have a way of thinking, libertarians have a way of thinking, and I talk to so many people, and I've even sort of done enough reading on this to know that there are different ways to address it with different types of people. So it's like, okay, given your own operating system and your framework, let me explain this in a way that it will resonate with you, particularly if these are your concerns and your causes. Then you'll see how what you're advocating doesn't line up with what you're saying you kind of believe and support.
Surprising you got that reaction, because I use that exact same thought experiment all the time with people. I'm a libertarian. Everyone knows that. And I walk people through this, and it seems like when you get right up to the point where, well, yeah, then the police will, eventually murder you if you disagree and mean it, and you're like, I just want to be left alone. Yeah. And then they say, well, wait a minute, then you assaulted a police officer. I'm like, wait a minute, like that's where it seems to break down. I see there's something, at least maybe it's just an American thing. I don't know, but everyone I talk to seems to have this like separate category for police that somehow that they get to act and behave with ethics that are completely opposite of regular citizens, that they can, act in such a way.
Is that mostly conservatives?
Both sides.
Both sides. Okay. I've found, I wouldn't be surprised if conservatives had more of that viewpoint in America.
Historically, that's the way it's been. I'm almost 50. I'm 49 years old. I watched the left. It's very weird. They flip-flopped. The left used to be very pro free speech. They used to be very skeptical of corporate power. They used to be skeptical of government in certain aspects. They were pro welfare state, but they were sort of against excesses around police violence and various things, right? And conservatives were very law and order, very pro police, pro military. And it seems like everything's gotten weird. The lefties are all pro-war. They want to go to proxy war with Ukraine, start World War III, invade Syria. Everything has flipped. They're anti-freedom, and it's so. I have a very difficult time orienting myself in this new political landscape. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but I feel like that is something that both sides seem to share. Maybe less so with the new breed of Republican. I don't want to call them conservative. I don't think Trump people are conservative anyway. Most of them anyway.
Yeah, some are.
I don't want to paint with a broad brush, but that group as a whole, it feels like it's not what I would consider traditionally conservative. Yeah, it's a new thing, but they seem to be more skeptical of police, and maybe it came from the pandemic and some of the stuff that happened throughout that. I'm not exactly sure, but I feel like for the most part, I run that thought experiment, and both sides they break down to me like, no, police are different animals. They put on a costume and a badge, and they get to act in a way that if a citizen did the exact same action would constitute a crime, and they're totally fine with that.
You know what's this is such an interesting conversation, and I haven't spent that much time thinking about it. So I'm always just thinking out loud on podcasts anyway, right? Not everything I say is all that well thought out, but hopefully it's coherent. I think in every society, in every nation, in every culture, we have certain, I don't know what I'd call them, grand myths, collective illusions that you sort of need to have for a society to function. And it's interesting you make this point. I've never really thought about it that deeply, but I think one of those things is, say, pertaining to police. So what they're saying, while it might not be totally, if you just take the view that, we're all human beings and kind of individual agents with the same, rights and so on and so forth, then that argument that you're kind of making stands. But we do have this collective belief that, yeah, the police are different, and we kind of have to, because if we don't, so especially around the world, so U.S. is slightly different because in the U.S. citizens can own guns. Mm-hmm. In virtually every other country, only the police can. So they are this like separate category, and most people would absolutely agree, hey, we do need police officers, we do need these people with guns and badges to have this law and order. So there is this delineation between your everyday citizen and police officers. So maybe that's why kind of like in the mental framing, it's like, yeah, well, they are different. And even from a legal perspective, it is different, right? Assaulting a police officer is a much greater crime with a greater punishment than assaulting a normal everyday person. So on one hand, you could say that doesn't make sense. But on another hand, it's like, well, within the collective agreement, that does make sense. And we have a lot of these. We have a massive one around money. Money, right? Money might be the biggest like sort of collective illusion where we've all just sort of agreed that this paper, which is not really backed by anything and which is just, you know, looking to fractional reserve lending and right, it's just kind of printed out of nowhere. But we all agree, hey, this US dollar is, we all agree we can trade with this. And then you switch countries and actually they don't accept the dollar anymore, right? Because there's a different, it's like, no, that's not the piece of paper we want. We want this piece of paper. So I think in every sort of nation and every culture, you kind of have to have these myths. Otherwise, society doesn't function. Another very obvious one is just the line between the government and the people. The government, if it's viewed, if any other group of individuals tries to do many of the things the government does, it's called a gang, it's called a mafia, it's called organized crime, right? Taxation, that's extortion or theft, right? The way they go to war or use the threat of violence, it's like, no, like another person would go to prison for that. So, but again, in the collective myth, outside of the libertarian world, the vast majority of people, it's like, yeah, there is this delineation between the politicians and the bureaucracy and this thing we call the government and normal people. So it's okay. That's how taxes are defended, because it's like, well, they have a right to taxes, right? If you even tried to withhold that or evade it or even maybe avoid it in a legal way, no, you're a bad person because they're entitled to that 40% of your money, right? If it were any other entity, that would be absurd. But because it's this thing we call the government or call the state, even the same people who are like, I don't trust politicians, I don't trust them, they still will look at that person who doesn't want to, pay his taxes as, hey, you're a bad citizen. You're a bad person. What you're doing is immoral. If that person ends up, getting arrested and going to jail, a lot of people will clap and celebrate it. So I think, I haven't fully fleshed this thought out, but I think that's why that argument breaks down at that point for a lot of people, because we have a lot of these things and they differ a bit from country to country and society to society. But, and I guess without them, it would be pretty hard to structure nation or structure society.
Would it though? And then maybe this is the autist in me that just and also the philosophy nerd, right? Because the question I always wrestle with is, do we actually have rights? Like, if so, where do they come from? Are they actually inviolable, or are they stuff that from a utilitarian purpose we can just decide to dispense with them? Freedom of speech, not really that important, and your bodily integrity, not that important. Can we do that as a society? Is that a collective thing, or does the individual are they have supremacy over their own being? Right. That's a deep question.
There's an interesting question as to why isn't there or why hasn't there, at least at scale, been like a libertarian country, certainly an ANCAP one, right? It's like, well, if that worked, probably somewhere you'd be able to find one, and like we can't. So it seems to be the case that when human beings organize themselves over the course of time, they do find these structures and ways of doing things that quote unquote work, at least function on some basic level. You can find good examples and bad examples of this, of course, right? But they sort of function on some type of level. And it goes beyond the politics as well. So, for example, It's interesting. I had this conversation with a lady yesterday at the I was at this Bitcoin conference, and I was talking to this lady who was she considers herself an atheist, although I'd question that after having a conversation with her. I think she has some childhood religious trauma, and the word God sort of upsets her, so she's replaced it with the universe or the source, but she sees the universe as like a conscious being that she can that can guide things. And anyway, I was like, I think that's just God by a different word. But anyway, we had a conversation where we were talking about, it came down to a discussion actually about essentially the sanctity of life. Because she was telling me she holds the position that, she actually asked me a pointed question where she asked me if I think that human beings are superior to other species. And I said, yes, I believe we're set apart. I believe we are I believe we are created in the image of God, and human beings, whether you even look at it from a religious or a non-religious perspective, it is clear that we are distinct from all other animal species, right? I'm not seeing cats doing podcasts and building cities. Okay, we're clearly set apart. And even the people who say they don't believe that, they act as if they do believe it. And she was telling me about, this, something about her cat. And I was like, well, even the fact you have a pet cat shows me you don't believe that, because that would be slavery. If the cat and if cats and humans were on the same level, owning a cat or owning a dog or something like that would be immoral. It would be wrong. So even people who say this stuff, like, they don't really believe it. So anyway, we end up kind of having a conversation about the sanctity of human life, and even the concept of, like, we've mentioned rights a lot here. You could say the concept of human rights is one of those collective illusions. Right? Or the sanctity of human life is outside of a religious framework. I wouldn't really be able to argue necessarily that human life is inherently sacred if I were to take my religious framework away. And I know, of course, there are people who don't believe that it is, and it leads to many of their other beliefs and positions. But we've all collectively agreed that there's this concept called rights, which are good and which we should have, and which, at least on paper, should be inviolable. Someone could actually make a pretty solid argument that it's all just, made up, and we don't really have those rights. But the collective agreement or illusion leads to a much better and prosperous society and nation than one that just throws away the idea of rights and just dismisses it outright and just says, no, that's just a myth. And so we're now going to act and behave as if that doesn't exist. So, even the most libertarian people will say, private property rights. It's like, you could make an argument for it, but you could also make an argument against it and say, well, I don't know, do animals have private property rights? No, not really. Is there anything else in nature? No, not really. We're kind of just saying, like, yeah, we're human beings, so we want to start with this basic right. And I agree with it. I subscribe to it. My simple point is just, like, regardless of the sort of size and scope that someone thinks the government should be, from the side of, the sort of socialists who think the government should be doing, like, everything, to people who think, like, very, very libertarian, it should be very small and narrow, we still need to have, like, a couple of things where we can, like, agree collectively, like, okay, let's all agree on this one. Let's all agree on this one at least.
And I feel we don't, though.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like there's so much confusion about it. You ask,
in what sense?
Like, the concept of rights, like, where do they come from? Do they actually exist? And I think most people are really confused about that. I don't think, other than, I think religious people have got the most clear-cut answer. They came from God, were created in his image. End of story, right? But I think you can get there from an atheistic frame point as well. Like, there's the natural law argument you wouldn't want to go back to. Obviously, there's first, they have to make a couple of assumptions and reason from first principles, but it's very simple to, get to a point where you understand you have property in your body. Like, you operate this meat machine, and these borders around your body belong to you, and nobody else has a higher claim on your body and your life than you do.
See, that's interesting, because I think, again, I'm not even here to, I wasn't not even planning to have, like, a, sort of faith-based conversation or something like that. But even with that one, I think there's there's a limitation to it, which can cause issues. So, for example, if that is the case, then the whole conversation around like what they call in the UK like assisted dying, or like in the Canada they call it MAID. This idea, like if you do have absolute bodily autonomy and nothing trumps that, and that's just your body. If you take your body, your choice to the logical conclusion, then it would eventually follow that you should have the right to, you know, if you don't want to be here anymore, you have the right to, you know, take yourself out of the spot. And of course, right, like technically no one,
do, right?
Yeah, technically no one can stop someone from doing that. But, it becomes kind of just that everything's just consent now. It's like, as long as you consent, right? If two consensual adults decide to, you know, hey, this guy doesn't want to self-delete himself by himself, but he's got whether it's a doctor or his friend, right? You see what I mean? Like that, someone could say, well, you know, he's kind of got a right to do that. And you lose the sanctity of the life in a way, because everything kind of just ends up boiling down to, it's just, well, was it consensual? Okay, then. And I don't know if we would want to live in a society, in a system where all morality and even sort of legality is just as simple as, is it consensual? Consent is important, but it's not the be all and end all. And I think that's where that kind of inevitably leads. And I'm not even just speaking sort of hypothetically, because we now have nations where this is happening. If you're seeing what's going on in Canada or in the Netherlands and so on, it's, you know, it starts very narrow.
And you depressed, Zuby? You consider killing yourself?
Like, over time, it's getting to like, wait, what? Like, what are you guys doing? Like, I don't think this is a net positive overall in terms of the sort of cultural and societal attitudes. You see this as well with all these conversations about like the trans stuff, particularly as it pertains to kids, and they're just saying, oh well, it's just that consent-based morality. It's just like, well, if that's what they want, and a doctor, you know, the almighty doctor decides that it's okay, then yeah, that 15-year-old, that 16-year-old should be able to, you know, go on hormone treatment or have bits of their body chopped off or render themselves in sterile. And so, like, same person who can't even get a tattoo, and you're saying they should, and it's like,
yeah, that's wild.
Yeah, it's wild. At the same time, it's unsurprising to me in a way. Like if that framework is adopted, then it's like, well, that's where you'd kind of end up, in the same way that the people who advocate that, as it pertains to minors, you then are also eroding the argument against like childhood sexual activity. If you're saying a 14-year-old is old enough to consent to changing their body permanently in these massive ways, then what's the argument against them being able to do all of these other things? And I think that, again, most people don't sort of think of it this way because they don't think of it that deeply. But it's like, well, the whole thing about age of consent is about like mental development and maturity, and we have to have a delineation between adults and children in the law and how we treat people and so on. Like, again, everyone kind of agrees to that, and they're sort of playing this dangerous game where they're flirting with, over time, like eroding that and making it very gray. At which point it's like, well, why can't a 13-year-old get a tattoo or engage in this or engage in that? And I think even just kind of at the core in people's hearts, they know it's wrong, or like they know there's something wrong with that, but maybe they don't have the ability to articulate why it is, but they know, like in their heart of hearts,
it's like a moral intuition.
Yeah. We all have that moral intuition where something could be like wrong, and we know it's wrong, but you might not be able to perfectly articulate why, but you can sense it. You got that like disgust. I think it's called the wisdom of disgust, or the wisdom of repugnance, I believe it's called, where like you get that sense of like something makes you do that. And you
recoil.
You know there's something wrong there, even if you can't intellectually explain it perfectly.
Yeah, you raise important points, and this is what gives me pause as a libertarian. Is I know that freedom has responsibility on the other side of the coin. and we're in America in general is a nation with no responsibility. Like it's really gone out of fashion. It is all about immediate gratification. It's all about the individual. It's all about self-centeredness, and the lack of morality is a real problem because you're right. Liberty requires good people, because society will completely go off the rails. And so I'm not, advocating for this lightly, but I don't see lack of danger on the other side too. Like with when you lose liberty, like you've lost pretty much everything. And once it's gone, it's real hard to get back.
It's trade-offs. It's balance and it's trade-offs. And this is why I'm not really, I tend to not label myself politically. Because these terms are also quite relative. So obviously, like I live in the Middle East. So what conservative means here versus what it means in England, or what it means in the U.S. Even what it means in the U.S. versus what it means in England is not the same. I've often said before, somewhat jokingly, but also seriously, that I'm a progressive in Saudi Arabia, a liberal in Nigeria, and a conservative in the UK and US. and I lean libertarian like everywhere, right? So it kind of depends on the issue and the context of where I am. And, it is all trade-offs. I'm not, I don't have like a hardline ideology. Like, I have my faith as a Christian, but when it comes to politics, I obviously lean conservative libertarian by Western standards, but I think these things through. I can see the validity in certain things. I also just see how things play out. Like I'm fairly pragmatic. So, I've been in places where they're like, hey, let's just legalize drugs. And I see what it results in. And right now we're in a country where drugs are absolutely forbidden and illegal. And, I'm sure you haven't seen any homeless people or junkies walking around, or, gang activity or anything like that. So one more thing I think is important to say maybe is that I don't believe not every place should have the same laws. I think a lot of people, particularly in the West, have this idea that like everywhere should look like, I don't know whether they're from Canada or Finland or like every country across the world should have the same laws we do and do things the same way we do. Like when it comes to the USA, I'm very pro Second Amendment. I don't think the UK, for example, can or should introduce a Second Amendment. It wouldn't work. It doesn't have the historical.
Really?
No, because in the USA, like the guns have always been there from the inception. It's the reason the Second Amendment even exists is due to how the USA came to be. So Americans, like, there's more guns than people. It's been there. It's in the DNA. It's in the Constitution. It's in, like, it's core to the USA. But in a country like the UK, like if a politician in the UK was like running on a platform of like private gun ownership for like you'd be considered like extreme far right fascist. Like
wow.
Even amongst the conservatives, right? It's so far outside the Overton window, and there's no appetite for it. There's no historical context for it. There's no, like, amongst the people, they don't want it. There's not really, if you were to introduce it, it would kind of be difficult to argue that it would help anything. It's just, the country's in a very different place. It's like in Saudi Arabia, alcohol is illegal, right? And I don't think Saudi Arabia should legalize it. They're a Muslim country, 99% Muslim. Like, it's against their religion. It's against their faith. Alcohol itself is not like a good and healthy thing for a society individually or collectively. Like, why would they want to like suddenly have their population drinking? Does that mean I advocate banning alcohol in America and England? Good luck banning alcohol in England, right? Like,
right.
Like it's culturally there. It's in the DNA. It's been there historically for thousands of years. So, there's the obvious things we all agree on, right? Murder, theft, right? Like so on. Like, and there's a reason why every country has agreed, yeah, we don't allow those things. But then with lots of the other issues, it's like, well, depending on a combination of history, culture, religion, the population. I'd even say the population size. Running a country of 5 million people is not the same as running a country of 500 million people. I assume that India and China with over 1.2 billion people each, they probably can't operate the exact same framework as Iceland, which has 300,000 people. You can't just turn the whole world into Norway or Sweden or something like that. So each place can and does, and I think should, have its own operating system that makes sense within the context of that. And depending on what someone means by freedom, or even means by safety or liberty or many of these other terms that we throw around, or even rights, it's going to look different. And there will be one place which, we're in the UAE right now, right? There's people who think, the UAE is this and this and this and this, and I never want to step foot. I'm like, okay, like I could live anywhere in the world, and I very intentionally chose to make the UAE my home, right? And I have my reasons for it, right? I think I'm much happier here than I was in the UK. And someone might think, you traded your liberty for safety, or you did this. I'm like, no, like it's way, way, way more nuanced than that. Even the concept of freedom itself is far more complicated than I think people make it out to be. And I don't believe that. I think a lot of people have been sold an idea that freedom and safety are opposite ends on a spectrum, and they're not. You can have places with no freedom and no safety. There's places that are very dangerous and you have no freedom. There's places that are very free and very safe. I would say like rural America, for the most part, would fit that. Tons of freedoms. You probably don't need to lock your door. Right? Everyone knows their neighbors, whatever. Like, it's fine. It's very free, very safe. You have places with some combination. You have places with safety but very little freedom. You have places with lots of freedom, very little safety. But I don't think they're at opposite ends. And I think you actually would. I actually believe you need a baseline. You need some baseline of safety to have freedom.
For sure you do.
Yeah, you need a baseline of safety. And someone could argue where that should come from.
And that's where I'm sort of struggling, right? Because you're a Bitcoin guy, you're a crypto guy,
sure.
and it's a disruptive technology that was meant to push back against fiat currencies and government homogeneity of where controlling the currency in this particular geography. This was a transcendent technology, and I think there are other areas that can be disrupted. Right? I agree with you. You need police. You need to have protection of property. You need to have protection of person. You need to have a judicial system that can actually, right issues, right, enforce contracts, and deal with people that commit crimes like that. That's a function that needs to exist. Yeah. And historically, I know why government evolved to take that role, but they do a terrible job, like they do with everything else. Yeah. So why could you not disrupt it with the private sector? I think particularly with the technology we have right now, think of all of the technology that we have that could be deployed by a private sector policing force that couldn't be done by government. Because
give me an example. I'm curious. What are you referring to?
Like monitoring. Think we have cell phones on us all of the time. If you consent, let's say your service is now ADT or whoever is going to, protect your family, like they could, through technology, monitor you all the time if you consented to it, right? Whereas the government, we would never allow them to do that because obviously that's got a bunch of, second order effects that are pretty negative. I don't think people think through the potential, right? Just like with crypto, like this is a whole transformational sector. I think there are other areas where we all agree, like you said, we all agree certain things need to be done. The question is like, who needs to do it? And maybe I'm, just a pie in the sky and being too visionary about this, but I like Michael Malice's quote, which is, anarchy is a relationship. It's not a location.
Yeah.
I don't think we have to make everybody within this encircling boundary be exactly the same, particularly like you said, China, perfect example, massive country, or the United States, 300 million people. Do we all have to be completely homogenous? Like the Midwest is very different than Florida is very different than Vermont. I don't know necessarily if we have to all do things exactly the same way. Maybe we do. It's an open question for me.
We don't. And I also think we can't. I think it's a silly goal in the same way that I think like equity, equal outcome or whatever is an equal goal, or like everyone earning the same amount is a silly goal. It's like people are different. Funnily enough, these people who push this, it's like at the same time they love to scream about diversity. And I'm like, diversity is the reason why inequality exists. We have inequality because of inherent diversity. Like you can't have, let's yay diversity, but also like get mad that things are unequal. Like that's just how it is. It's kind of fascinating. Like, I think that with a lot of people, they want things to function. And I find that when the So I'm someone who, at my heart, I lean pretty libertarian, and a lot of people would consider me a libertarian. But it's kind of interesting, like living in Dubai, for example, or like I grew up in Saudi Arabia. Okay, so both of those, Dubai, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia, neither of them are democracies. Most people would not consider them like so-called liberal countries and so on. And like I live in Dubai right now, and the government is good here. People here like the government in general. So it's like a very different, like I've lived in the UK, I spent tons of time in the US, I've been to 45 countries, I've been to places where the government is way worse than it is, say, for example, in the States. All right, my family's originally from Nigeria, right? And people are there not fond of the way, right? But so people actually, I think we talk so much about like what government should look like and what its size and its scope and everything should be. But I think it just sort of in real life, most people want it to be good and functional more than they actually, as much as they talk about like caring about the size of it and things like that. I think in real terms, it's a little bit of a distraction. I think that on the ground, most people don't tend to care. They tend to care, are things working and functioning or not? And do I feel free? Right? If you've got like some authoritarian tyranny on you, right? Like that's, even if things are clean and functional, like you're gonna not feel good about it. You're gonna feel like something and someone is watching over you all the time because they are. However, it's interesting. Like when you talk to people, for example, from some of the Scandinavian countries like Finland or Norway, Iceland, they also generally like the government. Now, I don't want to be paying 40, 50% of my money in taxes and having like, that's not the system I would personally opt into. But when you talk to people who are from there, for the most part, like they're cool with it. They don't have like the sort of anti-government thing that people do in the US or even people do in the UK now, because it functions like in terms of what it's telling you it's going to do. They generally do it. So like, yeah, they do have, it's not free healthcare because they've paid for it with their taxes, but it's good healthcare and their schools and their universities and the roads and infrastructure, and it's good. So they're like, yeah, like they're not mad at it. Like you don't get that many. I'm sure Finnish libertarians exist, right? But it's not right. It's not like sort of a bastion of libertarianism. I think you get like more libertarianism and more like demand for, anti-government when it's not functioning. It's not doing what it's supposed to, and it's wasting trillions of dollars, and the problems are still there. You go to the US, you step into these big cities, and you've got tens of thousands of homeless people, and there's tents down the street, and the roads aren't very good, and it's just like, wait, like what? Something's wrong here. I'm paying all of this money in taxes, and they're like, "Whoops, we lost another trillion," right? Like, yeah. Right, and then you're seeing where it's being shipped off overseas and so on. So I think like that builds like more libertarian sentiment, because it's just like, hey, this isn't working. So I think the question about the size and scope of the government is very interesting, and I lean towards small government, but at the same time, I think I've established myself personally. I think I care more about good governance than like its size per se. And there's so many different ways to look at it. So again, right now we're essentially in a tax-free country. Okay. So if people again want to talk about, freedom and stuff, I'm like, well, are you free if you're giving 30-40% of your annual income to the state?
Yeah, people don't think about that, because it's not just the monetary. They don't take that step back and think that's actually 30 to 40, 45% of my life they've taken from me, that I've been basically an indentured servant to somebody else. And that's real.
It is. So it's interesting. I have, it's impossible to mention Dubai online without like getting all sorts of, comments and things like that. So I've had so many, conversations and even sort of debates with people I know and separate about this, who are like, oh, well, what about this and this and this? And you can always respond with, yeah, well, what about this and this and this? And the things that they tend to like focus on are, they're pretty fringe in terms of, right? The people will be like, oh, well, go burn a Quran in the street and see what happens to you. I'm like, I don't do that when I'm in England or America either. Like, I don't really have like something in my brain that like in my heart really wants me to like desecrate somebody's religion in the same way I wouldn't like we could have a question about whether it should be like legal to burn a flag or burn a Bible or burn a holy book, right? Like we can have that conversation, but I'm a bit like, do you want to? Like, is that your sort of litmus test for if a place is like good to live in or not, right? Again, I could flip it and be like, oh, well, how much are your taxes? What do you pay in property tax, capital gains tax, personal tax? You know what it is for me? Fat zero, right? I'm like, oh, I'm freer than you are, right? So it kind of depends on which lens you're looking through and ultimately your priority. But I'm a big advocate for, I'm going to shout out to Andrew Henderson from Nomad Capitalist because he kind of coined this term, and it's something I've kind of believed in for a long time, which is I believe in, go where you're treated best. We're all different. Every single person is different. We have different belief systems. We have different priorities and things we care about. Our family dynamics are different. We're all very different people. We have different jobs. And increasingly, I think in this century, it's already happening. But I think in this century in particular, we're going to see the greatest international mass migration ever. And it's not going to be as simple as what it's looked like over the past couple centuries. Over the past couple centuries, it's typically been like east to west. And, everyone wants to be in Europe, or everyone's trying to get to US. That will continue to some degree, but I believe we're going to see a lot more west to east migration. And in this century, nations, cities, states, they're all going to have to compete for people. It's already happening. You're seeing this migration in the U.S. Why are people, moving from New York to Florida and from California to Nevada, Arizona, Texas, right? Because they're voting with their feet. You're running all these different experiments with different policies and different ways of doing things, and people over time are, hey, actually, it makes more sense for me to be here. It makes more sense for me to be here. And I see this happening more and more internationally. I think we're at the very early stages of it. I'm an example of this. I know almost everyone in Dubai is an example of this because it's 90% expats.
Yep.
And we've all chosen to come here from Russia, from England, from India, from wherever. And I just think that that's going to really accelerate over the next few decades. A lot of the places that maybe even 50 years ago would have been considered unlivable or just like low quality of living, things are going to change. I think people underestimate how much the world is going to change in many ways. But I think one of those is, just a few decades ago, China was like a really poor country.
It still is. I was there a few years ago. I was talking to somebody that was like, the average salary for a doctor there was like $37,000 US. Like people don't make a lot of money
That's
there.
Not that far off the UK for a doctor.
Really?
No. So when you said that, I'm like, no, doctors earn way more in the US than they do in the UK, way more. So I was like, no, it's not that bad. But China used to be like poor, like it was a Japan that everyone was like worried about. Like now people are, China's like a rising power. And so a lot of that's, I think one thing that happens is we have like a recency bias and we have a what we know bias, right? So we imagine the world and nations looking like how they've looked throughout our lifetime. So, but even, if I think when I was born, I'm 38. I was born in 86. When I was born, I think there were about 170 countries. Today, I think it depends on how you measure them, but there's about 200 now. So there's like more than 20 more countries, like recognized countries now than when I was born less than 40 years ago. So the countries that even exist will change. In 50 years' time, the world map with the borders is not going to look exactly like what it looks now. Some big nations are probably going to split. Some might merge. And like no one even thinks about that. And another thing that's going to happen is there will be places right now that someone just has a certain view in their brain of, and it will change. This country is only 53 years old, the UAE. If you were here 40 years ago, it's just desert. It was like, it wasn't. People come to Dubai now and they're like, wow, look at this, look at these buildings of Burj Khalifa. Wow, like none of that used to be here. Like they just took a desert and built an entire city in a couple of decades, which is pretty remarkable. But let's take a country like the world's most populous nation, India. About 1.3 billion people. I haven't been to India, but we all have an image in our brain of India.
I've been there a few times.
Okay, you've been there a few times, right? And I know many people who have been there. I know many people from there. But India is not going to stay like exactly how it is. 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 50 years from now, by the end of the century, what you imagine in your brain as India right now, I would wager it's going to look vastly different. And then there's many other nations. Some of them are, further along in this regard. In the East, it might be Thailand, it might be Malaysia. There's probably going to be some nations that aren't even really on our radar right now. I would love to see some countries in Africa like blossom.
They're going to. Africa is going to be huge in the next 50 years.
Yeah. So things are going to just, things are going to change, and those lines of power are going to change. You could even look into, say, like the populations are going to be very different, especially with the whole birth rate thing that's going on. You're going to have some nations where their population massively shrinks, and you're going to have other ones where they very significantly grow. Like, I think Nigeria is on track to become the world's third biggest population within the next few decades. I think it's like seventh right now, but because of the birth rate, China's, gonna take a dip. India's gonna keep growing. Like, Nigeria is gonna grow way more. And I don't know what is, I don't know what all of this means exactly, but I think it's fascinating to just like sort of look at certain trends and trajectories and see, oh, okay, like in the course of my own lifetime, this thing's gone from here to here, or this nation has changed in this way. Another one that's significantly changed. I was in El Salvador in June, gone from being the most dangerous country in the entire world to being the safest in the whole Western Hemisphere within 5 years.
That's wild.
That's wild. First country to adopt a Bitcoin as legal tender, because they're also the poorest country in Central America.
Yep.
I see that changing. Like, if Bitcoin's going to do what I think it's going to do, and they've got that first runner advantage, I think that El Salvador could end up being, it could end up being like the UAE of Central America, where like people are flocking to go live in San Salvador, and it's just this new economic hub and entrepreneurial hub. And there might be some other spots in Central America or South America that are like that. Who knows? We can't predict it. We can look at certain trajectories, but I don't know. It excites me to think about, and I think it's ultimately good. I think it's going to be good for people to have. I think it's going to be great to have more great places to live. I don't think it should just be everyone wants to go to UK, Canada, US, right? Like there's always been this sort of handful of countries, fewer than 10, where like almost everyone who can go wants to go. I think it'll be cool to have like 50 countries where they're all economically developed enough and free enough and safe enough and enough opportunity that they're appealing. I think that's overall a good thing for humanity, not to have it so centralized. I quite like decentralization.
100%.
Yeah, I think it'll be good for it to be more decentralized.
Yep. Well, I would be remiss if the remaining time I didn't talk to you about your faith, because I know that you're a Christian. I know that's a really important aspect of your worldview and who you are as a person. And I'm somebody who you call out earlier. Somebody that had that little religious trauma growing up. I certainly did. I grew up Catholic.
A lot, sadly.
Yeah. It was really rough, and sort of I went atheist really hard for a while. The new atheist thing. I was a full Reddit atheist for a while. Sorry. But I've had some experiences. Mediated by psychedelics, so that happened. But it certainly opened my eyes to a point where I'm open now. So I consider myself an open-minded skeptic. And so I always like to talk to people, religious philosophers I've had on the show, and just lay people, just to get their take on it. Like, well, so why do you believe in God, number one? And number two, like, what do you conceptualize God being? Because I have a hard time pinning that down sometimes. Like, it seems like a concept that's a little bit too hard to enumerate.
Sure. First thing I'm going to say is I will make this answer to the best of my ability and with a lot of humility. There are people who are better equipped to answer this question than I am, who've really studied theology and who spend all day, every day over decades doing this. But I'll give my best answer. So in terms of why I believe in God, I think there are two main arguments from just being rational here. I think the first is that everything that comes into being has a precursor. we recognize this in our own world and life. If someone was trying to convince me that nobody and nothing made this cushion or this building or that laptop or something, it obviously wouldn't make sense. So just going backwards and thinking of looking at the world we live in, and obviously we're just on Earth, but we know that there's all these planets and there's the whole solar system and galaxies and a whole universe that's out there. Just very logically and rationally, the idea to me that all of that essentially came out of nothing, that there was no first mover, both in terms of the how, but also in terms of the why, rationally makes me believe in God. It makes me believe in a creator.
What do you mean by why? Because by the way, I got
Sure.
Lawrence Krauss coming on the show in February. He wrote a book called The Universe from Nothing. And he gets in trouble with philosophers about defining what nothing actually means. And he also says when people ask why questions with respect to, cosmology or where did the universe come from, they're really asking a how question. Okay. So I want you to delineate, like, what do you mean? Because you said there's a why and a how portion.
Yeah, sure. So we can start with the how. Right. So, I mean, I would ask, as someone who's is a hardline atheist, okay, how do you believe everything came into being? And, most people would go back to, a Big Bang. And when they explain it, it doesn't sound any less fantastical to me than believing that, like, there's a God, right? It's just like, well, there was an explosion. What if, like, I don't know, out of nowhere, there was some primordial ooze or something. I don't even know the exact arguments that people use, but I'm like, just the idea that something, not just something, but something with as much complexity as our world and our beings, like that just came from nothing. It doesn't logically make sense to me. And someone could say, oh, well, that doesn't mean that it was God, or it was, because I think, again, with the word God, people like to picture, a big man with the sky. Sure. Because of the paintings. It's actually because of all those paintings that, people, God is reaching out. Like, I don't know if God is a big guy in the sky with with a white beard. Maybe so. But,
almost certainly not. Let me probably say that.
So I think because of that sort of thing in our brain, we tend to think that way. So, and of course, as a believer, we believe in God being infinite. Infinity itself is not a concept our human brains can really wrap their head around. We sort of know what it means, but we're used to everything being finite. So the concept of something having no beginning and no end and always having been there, right? Because people would be like, well, what made God? And it's like, well, God's like infinity in all directions, so nothing made God. But they're almost using the same argument, right? They're saying, well, there must have been a precursor.
Yeah, you're referencing the Kalam cosmological argument.
Yeah,
correct?
so there's that. And then you wanted me to touch on the why. Yeah. When I say the why, I just mean, like, there's always that question of, like, what's the meaning of life? Like, why are we here? We already touched on the point that it seems self-evident to me that human beings are unique and distinct. We are animals biologically. And there are lots of cool and interesting animals in this earth. I like animals, but it's like, we make cities. We have these types of conversations. We are on a whole other level to, chimps and apes. Like, they're cool. They can do some interesting stuff, but there's a very, very serious gap there. So when I say the why, I just mean, I believe that there is a why as to our purpose here on this earth. I don't think it's just as simple as we're just advanced apes on this spinning rock hurtling around a giant flaming ball of gas. And I think that's even written in our hearts. I think it's why even so many atheists are intrigued by psychedelics and, trying to find the why and trying to find that meaning. And everyone's looking for it. People do have that spiritual thing within them. I would say, well, yeah, obviously, because you're created in the image of God. Of course it's there. And that kind of leads into, I guess, my second argument. I would say that there's a moral case for God as well. So we've touched a few times even in the conversation about there being kind of the idea that we obviously have our conscience and we have a moral compass. I mean, in the Bible, it says that, the laws written in the heart of man, and we kind of inherently know this because we do have a sense of right and wrong, which tilts us in a direction regardless of our faith. And I would say that I believe that most people would agree that objective morality does exist. So there are...
I don't know about most, but a lot of people
people would say murder is objectively wrong.
Boy, I don't know. Like, I've talked to a lot of people, particularly on the left, and
I'm saying most people. I'm not saying there's no exceptions. If you go around the world, and you poll people and you tell people, is murder inherently wrong? Is it objectively wrong to just walk up to an innocent person on the street and just murk them? Right? 99.9% of people will say yes, absolutely. Right? So most people would agree. And you could take like the most obvious things, right? Because obviously there is gray area. There's things that we've already touched, like some things become a bit subjective. But it's clear to me that there is objective morality. And I don't think the concept of objective morality makes sense or can exist in the absence of God or a creator being the ultimate arbiter of what is right and what is wrong. Because as we've talked about before, and as we're seeing, when we're left to our own human devices, in fact, the more intellectual you are and the smarter you are, the easier it is to rationalize anything. And you can kind of come up with an argument for, you can start coming up with arguments. Well, is murder really always wrong? Right? It's why like all these left-wing academic types, like they want to argue like everything, right? They want to, well, is it really wrong? Is it, well, what about this, right? Who's the authority on that? And again, from a religious perspective, you'd say, well, God ultimately is the arbiter of that objective morality. Around the fringes, we can have those debates and arguments. But again, at least when I want to know what people behave, it's not perfect, but you often, how do you actually behave and act in the world? And most people act and behave as if this objective morality does exist, at least on certain big things, and even our legal systems are formulated around it. That's why doing certain things gets you thrown in a prison or can even get you executed, because it's like, hey, that thing is so immoral and so wrong that we need to separate you from society. And I think in the absence of God, it's hard to make the case of objective morality, because it ultimately boils down to power and popular opinion and subjective feelings. It's why, again, this is kind of a deep conversation, because obviously not all atheists hold this position, but almost everyone who holds this view of like gender is just a social construct and you can be anything that you identify as and it's all just subjective and all this like postmodern stuff, there's a reason why they're almost all atheists. So it doesn't mean all atheists hold that position, but to kind of hold that position and rationalize it, you need to come away from the concept of not just objective morality, but you could say objective reality, that even objective reality exists. Everything now is just subjective, and it's feelings and it's opinions and it's just power plays. Yeah. And if you're saying there's only two genders, it's just because like you're trying to use your, I don't know, some dominant discourse. Yeah. You're trying to like just sort of use this power to oppress people. Like I think we both agree that all this stuff is nonsense, right? Yeah. But those arguments can only be made within that sort of framework or lack of framework. So I would say for me, when it comes to just believing in God, in short, if I could summarize it, the world makes more sense to me if God exists than if he doesn't. Of course, if we're talking about like specific faiths and, specific Christianity, that's another conversation. But I would say that that's why I'm a theist.
Got it. And we don't have to go down that road. It was just from a theist
and
versus.
Thanks for asking that, because you made me think through that one. Because
is there any bigger question though?
That often.
Like we were talking about Bitcoin and stuff. Is there any bigger question? Like these really meta questions about existence. What is reality comprised of? Does a God exist? Like where do we come from? Like those are the ones that keep me up at night. And I'm genuinely like, I'm looking for the truth. And it feels like a very squishy one to suss out. It's a difficult concept. It's so big. It's so
and look, there's that's why I started with a caveat about humility, right? Because oftentimes people don't want to do that. It's called faith, right? It's called faith for a reason. Okay, so sometimes when someone wants like a sort of precise mathematical proof of God or something, I'm always like, we're kind of asking the wrong question, because it is faith. There are so many things, and it's interesting. The faith is an interesting thing because we all have it, because there are many things that we all believe that we can't like prove.
For sure.
Even just like the way people are so kind of do the trust the science thing, or trust the historian, right? We kind of take as a given that like certain historical figures existed or certain events happened or something. And if someone is like, well, prove it. And it's like, well, I mean, we have like a couple documents or something, but it's like,
Right.
like you can't really, we can't go back thousands of years ago, and it's also why I kind of find it intriguing when I do hear some of these conversations happening, and people are like we don't really know like what's at the bottom of the ocean. There's so much about the world, let alone our own solar system, we don't know.
Yep.
And people like just 2 years ago, wasn't it like last year or 2 years ago, where I don't know, some big group of scientists like decided that they were off by like 7 billion years on how old the Earth is. Do you remember that?
I heard something about that, but I don't have the details.
I think they thought there was like X billion years that they'd always been saying, and then they were like, oh no, we were off by like 7 billion years or something. And it's like, well, I'll read things, even things about like evolution, and they're saying 300 million years ago this happened, and then 250 million years. I'm like, how do you know?
Right? For sure.
I'm a bit like, so you think I'm crazy for believing in God, and you're just there casually telling me like with confidence, like 300 million years ago, like this thing happened. I'm like, oh, maybe it did. Maybe you're right. But like, surely that's a bit of a faith statement.
It definitely is. I think people with science, they understand that. They understand that it's always updating.
Yeah.
Right. And we know this is our provisional understanding, always willing to update. And I think that's been the criticism of religion, at least, dogmatic religion, is that you're locked in the box and you can't update.
Do you know what's so funny about it? Is that at least in these modern times, in the last few years, for sure, it seems quite the opposite. It seems
Science has got pretty religious-y, hasn't it?
Like when I look at the most dogmatic people, it doesn't tend like I'm not pretending there are not dogmatic religious people. Of course there are. And there are people who are not willing to even have the conversation or talk to someone who doesn't share their exact worldview. I'm obviously not one of them. But that is not unique. It's clear to me that is not unique to
shut up is safe and effective.
Yeah, like if I'm looking at the people who are canceling their friends and shunning their family members, and of course, like over the last several years, whether that's over Trump or it's over COVID or it's over whatever other BLM, whatever other thing, it's not generally like the religious folks who, for all these years, people have been saying, hey, you're the dogmatic ones, you're the intolerant ones, so on. I'm kind of seeing the opposite going on, where people who are religious or agnostic are happy to have the conversations and have the discussions and the disagreements. And some, not all, of course, right? But, some people who claim to be all about the science and evidence and this and that, not only are they telling you that men can get pregnant, but they also want to not even discuss the issue. And it's like, well, I've studied science. And one thing I certainly know about science is like discussion and conversation and debate and experimentation is how it's meant to operate. Remember when like Fauci said, I am the science? Like, criticizing me is criticizing science. Like, that's not how science is meant to work. Like, why can't I ask these questions?
Yeah, I think the scientific establishment just itself needs to be updated. I think the institutions have been so wholly corrupted. And that's where I guess I'm not a political person. I don't vote. I pay attention. I talk about it, but I guess it's the one area where I've got a little bit of hope with this incoming administration is that maybe some of this rot can get, excised from these institutions. I don't have a ton of faith in that. I've seen too much. I've been disappointed too many times, but I at least have hope. I think there's that. And I think the Doge thing, they might move the needle a little bit. So I'm trying to be hopeful about that.
Yeah. Well, I think whatever they do or don't do, they'll do better than what the other side would have done. And sadly in the US, despite having, they always say 330 million people, I bet it's probably closer to 380. It's still a binary choice, essentially. which is a whole other conversation. But I guess when you look at it that way, I'm happy that to me it's not Trump is only like a small factor of it. To me, it's like the administration, the people around him, and also just the way the culture is kind of swinging. I think I said on a podcast back in, I think 2022, that I think we've passed peak woke, and I think that is being validated.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think that just the past 10 years have been very strange in many ways, and I just think your average American, Brit, Canadian, Australian, just your average person is just like, all right,
had
enough of that, right? You've been beating us over the head for the past 9-10 years. I'm tired of being called racist. I'm tired of being called transphobic because you're trying to put boys competing against my daughter. Like, I'm tired of just the censorship. I'm tired of like being called a fascist or a Nazi or whatever, just because I don't like, people are just, it's enough. All the corporate stuff. June, rainbow flags everywhere. Hey, let's dedicate 180 days a year to celebrating the LGBT community. It's like, okay, enough. I'm already like, everyone's already equal under the law, reasonably. like we've done this, like we've got here, you know. And if you engage in the real world, again, this is a part of the reason why I think wokeness, you know, you can't like kill an ideology totally, right? Like, it's the same reason communism keeps popping back up. But the reason I think it's like sort of really on its last legs and is going to just sort of shrink in importance, part of it is just because it's not in line with reality. So a good way, it's not perfect, but I think a good way to know if something has truth in it is how, like, Lindy effect, right? Like, how long does it last? Does it sustain?
Yeah.
Okay. So even to talk about like my own faith, right? So even for the people out there who think like religion is bad, right? The people who have the whole like, you know, religion is bad and Christianity is bad. Well, it's like, well, man, there's lots of arguments against that. But even moving outside of the faith, just from like a purely pragmatic point, it's like, okay, well, this is something that was like Christianity. It's like this. The fact that we even say we're in the year 2024, it's like 2024 years after what?
Since what?
Right? But even it's like, okay, this lasted for millennia, and it has generally led to, whether or not someone wants to admit it, like so many of the good things in the West were built upon these foundations. And even to this day, even according to like secular sources where they're doing these studies, and you're looking at happiness and you're looking at birth rates and you're looking at communities and so on overall, it's like, hey, the people who believe in this thing, whether or not someone thinks it's true or correct or real, it's like, they seem to be thriving somewhat. And this opposite, look at those doing the complete opposite. It's like, there's a lot of depression going on here. There's a lot of substance abuse issues. There's a lot of just loneliness and listlessness and not really knowing how to orient yourself. Am I saying you absolutely need a religious faith to do these things? No, of course not, right? People always want to make that point. Oh, you're saying, I'm like, no, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying like if you're not Christian, you're immoral. I'm not saying atheists can't be good. I'm not saying any of that stuff, right? I'm talking like at scale.
Yeah, right? It's just generalization versus like,
I'm
I hate it when people do that. We make a
Yeah.
general claim and then you're like, well, I know a guy. It's like, oh,
Yeah.
no, I get your point. And I'm that's actually moved the needle for me quite a bit as far as not necessarily establishing the truth value of Christianity, but its value, right? Like it's a pragmatic value for society. And I think Nietzsche like called it out very, very plainly as like, you know, God is dead. That's a famous quote, but what comes immediately after that quote is like, and there's not going to be enough water to wash the blood from our hands.
People think he was celebrating it. They like to just end with that one. It's like, that's not his analysis.
And he was right. And so I think we've seen, you can't just take this whole structure of society and just rip off the roof from the cathedral and replace it with nothing and expect everyone just to you know, be mentally healthy and not nihilistic.
And I think what's been so fascinating with that, because I remember, you know, the new atheist movement, like when it was kind of in full swing and everything. And I think there was an assumption that, hey, look, if we can get rid of everything that's not like empirical and scientific and anything we feel like superstitious or whatever, we're going to be left with like a very sort of rational, logical, peaceful population. And I just think run the experiments to a
Failed.
point, and it's like, no, it doesn't seem to be. It doesn't quite seem to be working, right? Like not everyone is. It's just not happening.
And real quick, don't mean to interrupt, but
Oh, yeah.
you know, one of the four horsemen, Sam Harris, like he has been like the poster child of I mean, he wrote the Moral Landscape, and he's been engaging these discussions with you know, from the atheistic side with, you know, Jordan Peterson and all these other people. And he's been the poster child for sort of running into the ditch. If you've observed him in the last, you know, 3-4 years, like he's completely, you know, gone off the deep end. And I think, you know, looking to him to be like, his book was supposed to be the replacement for the, like, we can through neuroscience and rationality.
Yeah, just all rationality.
Yeah. And I think, you know, that's just, it's very apropos to the conversation to bring him up, because I think that's a perfect demonstration of somebody who's highly, highly intelligent, highly verbally fluent, thinks about things very deeply, and just without that sort of grounding, he's kind of off in the weeds.
Yeah, and I also just think, like, you know, we will see. It's I was at the Bitcoin conference for the past couple of days. You know, I did a few panels there and had multiple interviews, and I don't even want to sort of conflate Bitcoin with religion, because it's not. But just making my point about, like, almost like durability and the proof being in the pudding. So it's like, as we've already said, we can't predict the future. I don't know where the world's going to be 50 years from now, 100 years from now, let alone 1,000 years from now. But it will be interesting to see what endures, right? Because if something endures for that long and has, you know, is a net benefit to individuals and to society, then, as I said, even if it's not perfectly true, there's probably a lot of truth to it. This is why I know that, it's part of why I know that, like, marriage is good. Okay, I have a lot of issues with family courts and the way that modern marriage is done and so on and so forth, right? As I should. But as a concept, so it's like there was this institution that sprung up independently from China to the West to, like, in all these different places with actual different religious traditions and different backgrounds. They all figured out, okay, we're trying to organize society. We're trying all these different things. One man with, you know, lots of wives, and you know, everyone for themselves, and this and this and this, and they all sort of drift towards this institution of, this works. This works. This seems to be good for men, good for women, good for children, good for society as a whole. And so it's kind of like obvious to me that marriage is a good functional institution. Like if it weren't, why for thousands of years, why did it come to be?
Yeah.
And why for thousands of years has it been a bedrock of every society, right? Even ones that were not even in communication with each other. So that's like a pretty good sign to me. It doesn't mean like every single tradition that endures is always good, right? Of course not, right?
Sure.
we can think of exceptions to that, but I think it's a good sign. And ultimately, with all these things, man, I'm you know, I believe one day we'll find the truth. As we are here on this mortal coil, on this earth, we can chat and pontificate and discuss and debate and mentally masturbate over all sorts of different issues. But I think when it comes to the most core, most existential things, we'll, you know, certainly as a person of faith, I believe we'll ultimately find the truth. And you know what? If I live my life as best as I can, according to my faith and my principles, and I do my best to love my neighbor as myself, and to even love my enemies, and to treat people kindly, and do my best to follow the commandments, like, you know, if after all of that, one day I pass away and I find, I guess I wouldn't find anything, because I would, you know, if the hardline atheists are right, then there's just nothing, right? So it's like, if I'm wrong, it's like, okay, I guess I lived a good life, even according to the atheists. Okay, but like, hey, it's almost like that Pascal's wager thing. It's like, well, if I'm right, that's a big deal, right?
Yep.
It's like, okay, we'll all see. None of us have died and resurrected to report back on heaven and hell and the afterlife and all that. So ultimately, I'm humble enough to say we don't know, right? Well, I can say what I believe, but ultimately, you know, we don't know.
Yeah, we search for truth. So that's a great place to end it, man. I really, really want to thank you for coming out. I'm nobody. I've gotten no following yet, just getting started. But I love having these conversations, and hopefully over time this will grow, and maybe I'll have you back at some point, man. It was really enjoyable.
You did a great interview, man.
All right. Well, thank you. Appreciate it. All right. We'll chat later, man.
I appreciate it, man. Thank you.
Bye. All right.